Merciful God, we ask you to be with us this beautiful day. Help us to learn more about your word through another eye from a theologian. Help us to understand and to be energized by new ideas. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, well, how many of you have ever heard Walter Brueggemann speak? Anybody here? Okay, he's been on a favorite on the church lecture circuit for years and years and years. He's 89 years old now, and I have heard him, gosh, at two of the churches I was a member of, and went to see him, and when other churches had him, seen him at conferences. He's a popular speaker at religious conferences. So I had a chance to have lunch with him one time, and he has taught at two different institutions in his life, which is not very many for these folks. He started out at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, and then he was there for a long time, which is where he got his own seminary training and one of his doctorates there. And then he went to Columbia Theological Seminary in, I believe it was 1986. And at that point, Columbia, maybe not that early, but then became sort of the premier Presbyterian seminary. It had all the hot people, of the biblical scholars. They kind of took the crown from Princeton on that one. When my oldest daughter was in seminary there, he had just retired, but he was still professor emeritus there. And she worked at the library, and she would text me whenever Brueggemann came in, because she had heard about him, of course, throughout, being a church kid, and knew how famous he was. And she would text me when there was a Brueggemann sighting, or he talked to me today, at the front desk. It was like, for her, he was like a rock star. When you look at his biography, it says he's written nearly 150 books. I went and counted what they had on there. It was 146, but this was old. I looked on my shelf and I might have a few hidden, stuck at home, but I counted 21 on my shelf. So, he's been, he really has been a strong influence in theological thinking for a very long time. He writes everything from biblical commentaries. As far as I'm concerned, he's wrote the definitive book on Jeremiah. He wrote a colossal book called The Theology of the Old Testament, which, if you're really into Old Testament biblical scholarship, it's great. It's like about 800 pages. And he really came up with a unique premise there of how to read the Old Testament, the particularly conversations with God, and the prime as being like a courtroom, with he has a great, he emphasized the disputation, between God and humanity throughout the Old Testament. He's a Midwesterner. He's born in Nebraska, to a it's called a German evangelical pastor, which is what you might have known before the UCC joined several different Reform branches together with the German Reformed Church. That's why he's so popular with Presbyterians. Even though he's ordained as a UCC pastor, he is thoroughly Reformed in his theology, and so that's how he ended up at a Presbyterian seminary and so popular in Presbyterian congregations. Dewey Fitch told me he came here at some point. He heard him here. Been a long time ago, I guess. So, as I said, he writes books that deal with religion and theology, religion and sociology, some that are just pure biblical commentary. One of his most popular books is his book on the Psalms. And if you like the Psalms, that's one I would recommend. I think he says something like, God gives, somewhere along the lines is everything we give, everything we have, we get from God, and prayer is what we give back to God. And of course, the Psalms are very rich. He's thoroughly, Christian in terms of, being very grounded in the New Testament, having, been, a cradle Christian, a father who was a pastor, but he really excels in Old Testament scholarship. And so, like I said, if you like the Psalms, it's not one of these big tomes either. It's a small paperback book, but I think if you do, you would enjoy that particular book of his. This book, as you probably determined from the preface, I say that he's written about 150 books. Some of them are similar in that he's updated sort of his old classics. And this is what he says in the preface, is that he's updated some of his own things. In a way, it's kind of like he talks about with the Bible, that there's always something new there. And so when we talk about scripture, there's always something new, which is why he keeps updating, things that he's written in the past. Notice in the preface, he talks about utterances, which is what God has said, and then also utterances in terms of what we say about God. He talks. I'm always reminded of that the phrase in the communion liturgy of the mystery of our faith. He was saying, he imagines, he said, what must it have been like, for the first speakers about God, Abraham and Moses, that it's the idea of bringing something out of nothing, which is what God has done. And he's very, when he says the word, it has a very rich meaning for him. There are, assuming you've read the preface, you'll notice that there are certain words that he loves to use over and over again. And can you remember any of these words, or did that strike you in a way of certain words that you seem to be favorites of his?
Well, he does use utterances a lot.
Mm-hmm. He loves the word audacious.
Yeah.
I mean, he is one who thinks that, everything about the faith the scriptures, Christ, is revolutionary. That it turns the world for him, like with Luke, it turns the world upside down. Other words, and I want you to think about these words, because I think by the end you'll have a really good picture of his theology by the frequent use of these words, and have and as you go through the book, have a better understanding of what these words mean to him. Besides audacious, I would say resistance, abundance, scarcity. In a lot of his books, he talks about the psychology or theology as well of abundance versus scarcity, and trust in God's abundance, and what happens to us when we trust only in ourselves and believe what he calls the lies of scarcity, which we are so easily manipulated by. Anxiety, alternative. I have to laugh. I was texting my daughter while I was reading some things from his biography, and I said, it just struck me, and I had to text her. I said, do you realize that you were born on the same day as Walter Brueggemann, 50 years apart? That's kind of cool, since he was, used to be her theater. And she said, she thought that was pretty cool. And I said, and he's also a St. Louis Cardinals fan, which was natural. He spent a lot of time, in St. Louis, and my daughter just had moved from St. Louis. She spent some time there. And I said, and he's a Cleveland Browns fan. Of course, he's now in Cleveland. And she goes, wow, that's really weird. Cleveland, has he ever lived in Cleveland? And I said, no, not that I read this. They have a pretty small fan base. And, it's mainly just people who live in Cleveland. And and I said, well, he is an alternative thinker. We're going to get to that. So yes, he does use the word alternative a lot. Commodity is another catchphrase with him. And when he talks about how we take human things and make them into commodities. Mandate is another word. He believes that, because we are Christians and we want to be disciples, that we have a mandate to do certain things because we proclaim to be followers of Christ. So, imagining is another favorite word of his. And I like this quote, our text affirms we must not curb our asking or our imagining, but recognize the inadequacy of our asking and imagining. God still surprises us with more and better. And this goes to the heart of why we do Bible study, is that, there is, in God's imagination, what God has given us, there's always more for us to find, because we can never know, the whole mind of God. But even God is a changing entity, in that bringing things new, And so when we read the ancient scriptures, they are such that we can always find something new there, and something contemporary, to our own time. He says here, and I'll ask you what you think about this. He says, we're talking about our lack of imagination. He says, consequently, we ask only anemically of God because we do not trust much in God's agency. It is not fashionable in conservative circles to ask or imagine God's goodness beyond a rigid calculus of obedience. What do you think of that statement?
Would you read that again quick?
Yes, I will. It says, we ask only anemically of God because we do not trust much in God's agency. It is not fashionable in conservative circles to ask or imagine God's goodness beyond a rigid calculus of obedience.
Sounds like we're saying we're kind of afraid to approach God with a request, that we get all wrapped up in obedience and not really remember that he does bestow blessings. And ask and you shall receive, knock and the door shall be opened. Isn't that that's biblical? That's
Sure.
not just from a song, right?
Yes. When he talks about a rigid calculus of obedience, I think there he's referring to Christianity as defined by moralism, rather than seeing how big God is and how gracious, that we can, particularly in conservative circles, reduce it down like the Pharisees to following certain rules, rather than imagining how big the mind, the understanding, and the grace of God is. And then we get into condemning people for, our own ideas of what we think, would be Christ's moral code, when in fact, that doesn't define our faith at all. And it reduces God to kind of a petty tyrant, like the school headmaster, or something, rather than what God is, which is bigger and broader and more loving than we can imagine ourselves.
I was struck by something, and I even highlighted it in the vein of what you're saying in Anxiety and Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
He says, you might think that our Christian faith is all about getting the moral issues right and leveraging others to think and act the right way as we do. And then he says it's the contemporary loud posturing is not so much about faith as it is about our anxiety and maintaining control in the world. And that really struck me, so much so that I highlighted it.
Mm-hmm.
And he says it's not about pinning down moral certitudes. Our faith is not about pinning down moral certitudes. It's about openness to wonder and awe and glad praise. And I'm probably going to copy that and cut it out and put it on my bulletin board where I have my little words of wisdom that I can cut out of places.
Yeah. If you want to have maybe think, get into his mindset a little, there's a couple simple things you can do. One is to Google like Walter Brueggemann quotes, and you get a sense. There's one on there, it's like 25 quotes, and when you read those, I mean, they're good, statements of faith, but you really get a sense of where he's coming from. You can also listen to talks on YouTube. They're on there, and these are for a broad audience. And I think his lectures are more accessible even than his books, even the popular ones, because he's also a preacher and a teacher. And so when he speaks, um, I think it's easier to get at what what his theology is. He knows his audience, and it's not always, seminary students and academicians. That's something, if you're interested, I would encourage you to explore. I didn't find this book. It's certainly a lot more accessible than the hardcore biblical commentaries, but it's not quite as accessible as some other books that I have read. Sometimes you can get bogged down in his highbrow words a little bit, but again, I think it helps understand who he is if you've heard him speak. So that's why I would encourage you to look for that. Let's see. I'm going to go past the preface now and get into chapter 1, abundance and generosity. Again, these are two big words that you'll see over and over again in his books. That one of the great human flaws that he sees in terms of our faithfulness is how easy it is for us to be frightened by the idea of scarcity, even when it's a lie. And we see this, for example, throughout American history, every new wave of immigrants, they're coming to get your jobs, or, encouraging the hoarding, of wealth, because, for him, it is, very much like, Jesus' parables. It's not trusting God, when you, the hoarding of wealth, like the parable of the guy with the barns, who had the great abundant crop, and he built all these barns to store his wealth of crops, and then died, after he finished them. And you remember in the Old Testament, the story of the manna, when Moses was leading them out. He bases all this on, on the scripture, but he's looking at our contemporary life and how easily we become frightened if someone manipulates us into believing that someone's going to get something that we aren't, if we don't, stop them or hoard what we have. He says, when we do not trust in guaranteed abundance, we must supply the deficiencies out of our own limited resources. We scramble to move from our sense of scarcity to abundance that we imagine that we ourselves can supply, all the while frantically anxious that we won't quite make it. It is necessary to erode the holy time of Sabbath for the sake of productivity, given our sense of scarcity grounded in distrust. And, I go back to thinking about, all the stores having, now having to be open on Sundays and on holidays, on, the masses of parents who have these kids in sports, on Sundays, thinking that, they're going to get a sports scholarship,
Book study on here. I'm fine. How are you?
Jeannie, we can hear your conversation. I don't know if you're trying to talk privately. We can hear you.
Okay, bye. Well, I gotta charge the phone.
Okay. He wrote a whole book that I read on people becoming like commodities and our idolizing productivity. And he uses the story, the Pharaoh, of just working the Israelites to death to, build these great monuments to his own wealth and power. And he sees that in our society, we do the same thing in terms of feeling like we've got to be productive. I mean, if you look at the world, Americans work more hours than virtually any other first world country. We have the fewest vacation days, work the longest hours, and consequently, we don't make it into the top 10 of happiest countries. And he said that all goes back to, our fear of scarcity and our idolizing productivity, which feeds into that, which is something that comes out of that sense of scarcity. And he also, there's, I don't have page numbers with reading with the Kindle because everybody is having different, reading the book on different things. And of course, Dewey, when he gets to us, he's listening to it. But in one of the early pages of the chapter 1, he says, we baptized people are the ones who have signed on for the Jesus story of abundance. We are the ones who have decided that this story is true story. And the 4 great verbs, he took, he blessed, he broke, he gave, constitute the true story of our lives. As a result, we recognize that scarcity is a lie, a story repeated endlessly in order to justify injustice in the community. Now, take that apart and how do we justify using the idea of scarcity? How do we justify injustice in our communities?
Well, I think sometimes people think somebody else should take care of them, or there's agencies for that. I've got to take care of myself and make sure I have everything I need. So we kind of push them aside.
Mm-hmm. I think about, when he's talking about production, and I think also about an injustice, think about the profit margin,
Mhm.
and how we have created just people that are terribly burdened by work just to survive, in order to increase the profit margin of, the company, and the stockholders. We can't give health care to workers. That's too expensive. We can't have them work full time because then we'd have to give them health care. So instead, we'll just work them 30 hours a week, and then, they end up having to work 2 or 3 jobs, not only to make enough money, but to be able to afford health care.
Well,
That
that's
idea
exactly
that
what was going on.
Mhm. The idea that a company, always has to make a bigger profit margin, every single year. It finally gets to the point where the workers are just, become like slaves to the corporation. We look today in terms of economic health, and we see this wide gap there. And looking at well, some will say, well, we have these high prices because of there's a shortage. But then when we look at the companies that are producing, the goods, whether they be, fuel or whatever, they're actually making a larger profit margin than they've ever made before. So, is it really necessary to raise prices for them to survive, when actually they're creating their own abundance? He said, we notice that we have more than we need. We notice, if we are, following Christ, we notice that we do not need to keep so much for ourselves. We notice that as we share, more is given. Of course, this is repeated, over and over again, in the Gospels. So, is this something that you've experienced, of the more that you share, the more that you're given? Or is this just, a Hallmark sentiment?
Oh, I think it's very, very true.
Mm-hmm.
At least it has been for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He says that, and I think this speaks to, sometimes we look about what is the hope that he's talking about. And he says, we notice that every time we commit to the truth of abundance, new energy, new joy, and new well-being surge among us. So this, for him, this is part of the recipe for hope, is that we stop believing the lie of scarcity and seeing the abundance that God has provided. And that instills more contentment and also more hope for the future. At least that's what I think he's saying there. Right. Commodity thinking says that you share with your neighbor stuff that you can afford. Covenantal thinking, and that's another word he uses a lot, covenanter. Covenantal thinking says that you share first with your neighbor, and then you and your neighbors live on what you've got together.
I'm thinking of the survivors down in Florida. I was reading a story today about somebody who swam out his window to go to his mother's house, who was in a wheelchair, who was up to her armpits in water, to rescue her. And when he got her, he swam to one of her neighbor's house to rescue that person. Now that's neighborliness.
Yeah, for the stories. I was listening to one today about a woman who, she got a call from someone who knew she lived in the building to check on, a friend or a relative. And she did that. And then she proceeded to check on, everybody that she could think of. She went through the apartment building, even as they were evacuating or, rescuing other people. It is true. I think there are two ways of dealing with a crisis, and, one is to, as they say, save yourself, and the other is to save others. And we're seeing examples of that there.
This is an old story. I don't remember where I got it, about two people were trying to get up the mountain to Shangri-La. The one was carrying someone,
Mhm.
the other was not. And the one who was not carrying anybody, said, you better dump that person and just come along if you want to get to Shangri-La. And the person carrying the person said, no, I'm going to carry him. Well, they parted company, and the one carrying the person made it to Shangri-La. The other one did not.
I was thinking that you were going to say that the other one decided, well, if we both carry him,
No.
we can all get up.
No, I didn't look out. So,
Oh.
and there was a song, He's My Brother,
Uh-huh.
for that one. Yeah,
He's not heavy. He's my brother.
that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I recall that is posted on a sign in front of a boys' home in the Midwest. I think it was in Nebraska.
Mhm.
And
That's
that was their motto, was he's not heavy, he's my brother. Then somebody who I can't remember anymore, a long time ago, made a song out of that became popular.
Right.
Mhm.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, I was I read something about this was in a political article that there are these two senators from Florida who are asking the government for aid, lots and lots of aid for the victims of the hurricane in Florida, while at the same time they're calling to defund FEMA. And you kind of wonder. I don't know. I sometimes shake my head if people don't think about what they're saying. But you can't have it both ways. It says, but we are Jesus people, and therefore we are pledged and empowered to act differently in the neighborhood, differently in the economy, and as citizens of the last superpower, differently in the world. What do you think of that statement?
Well, I think that's what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he that's definitely a different viewpoint than that espoused by the people called Christian nationalists, which is kind of the opposite of that. So we are empowered, pledged and empowered to act differently. Yeah. So in what ways, if we're looking at, he's speaking here to the whole country, citizens of the last superpower, how have you seen our country act differently? I think back to the Lamentations passage, and that referred back to Abraham, that Abraham, God told him he would be a great nation, but this nation would be blessed to be a blessing, and that his nation would be a light to all other nations. If you remember, Ronald Reagan made a famous speech about our being the city on the hill, where he took a phrase from a gospel about wanting the hope that this country would be, that city on the hill, a light to the nations. If you remember,
Don't remember.
back at, we're all old enough to remember these things. The first George Bush, his sort of catchphrase was 1,000 points of light.
Yeah, remember that.
That, so how does a country become this light to the other nations in the biblical sense?
Well, I just think about the old days when we had a lot of immigrants coming over. And this was, when I went to New York City, I wanted to see the Statue of Liberty. You have to get on a ferry and go out to Staten Island, as some of you know. And I tried to imagine what it would be like coming from the potato famine, or coming from places where people were persecuted or in extreme poverty, and they're looking for that. And when they get there, to be able to see that Statue of Liberty and what that must have felt like, that's the 1,000 points of light for me right there, that symbol.
Mhm.
My grandparents saw that
Oh,
for coming in the harbor.
what did they say about it?
Just, we saw that, I remember people talking, they saw the Statue of Liberty, and at that time they only had 3 children, They waited until America to have the other 6, But
Think about-
That's hope for the future.
well, it struck me in that I can certainly, in the poem by Emilio Lazarus.
Emma Lazarus.
Emma Lazarus. And it struck me about that, because it, like, if they hadn't decided to come over, my grandfather would have been on the other side in the war, World War I. And that just, really means a lot to me, that symbol. Curiously enough, on Martha's Vineyard, there were signs up about "We are inclusive." And I think I took a picture of that and what it said by meaning about inclusive. And then another place on the East Coast, I saw the poem in someone's office window. And I thought that was indicative too, that was good to see. So.
I just imagine what a rough journey. And some people were, some of the immigrants, especially the Irish, which is my ancestry, were sickly and starving and dirty, and some of them died on the boat before they could get here. And after a horrendous journey from a pretty rough life, I just try to imagine what that must have symbolized for them. And I think for a lot of them, it gave a lot of hope. And I wish that we kept that, I wish we would keep that mentality. I wish we would remember where our ancestors came from and what they suffered just to even get here.
Yeah, that's a point. My sermon yesterday, which kind of focused on the importance of remembering, and that use. That's why we read so much in the Old Testament. God speaking to the people and the prophets to remember. And if you go to a Jewish service, you will hear that word so much. Remember. The idea of remember when you were slaves, in Egypt, and welcome the, remember, when you were in exile and you were brought back. That's a really, really important word in Jewish liturgy. Remember. And of course, that's what Jesus was saying to his disciples, at the Last Supper, remember, that this is, remember what I'm doing here. This is a symbol of what I have been doing for you and for the world, and keep doing it to remember. I think I recently read a book about immigration around, the turn of the century, and about, people coming into Ellis Island. And one thing I was struck with was how little it took to get here, and that you know, you had to have an identity paper and you had to be free of disease. You know, they kind of gave you a quick once over to make sure you weren't bringing in leprosy or something like that. And that's all it took,
Mhm.
you know. So when we, you know, talk about legal immigration today, it's a whole different ball game to what, you know, many of our ancestors, if they came over that way. We just got here. And he said, this is a quote from Brueggemann in the chapter 1. When you are full, do not forget, being full causes amnesia. Being comfortable causes indifference. Being secure makes us unresponsive. Do you remember, gosh, 20 years or so ago, there was a book called Affluenza?
Yes, I'm familiar with that and that concept.
Yeah, that, you know, once people, you know, are affluent, you know, they forget, once they have arrived, you know, at a secure point, they tend to forget what it was like before, and don't think about the people that are still in the struggle.
That was actually used as a criminal defense, believe it or not.
Yes. Oh, I remember doing a sermon including that a long time ago. You know, this kid that,
Yeah,
you know,
kid.
he the crimes, and they tried to use as a defense that he was brought up privileged, so he didn't
He
understand
didn't know.
about, you know, hurting others. And I don't think he was successful with that.
I don't think, I hope not. I'm pretty sure that didn't fly, but hey, a defense attorney has an
Mhm.
obligation to do the best they can.
But it made a lot of people think, you know. I mean, I think, you know, it made a whole nation, you know, think, and to kind of re-examine, you know, where we're going to draw the line, you know. And of course, Moses said that to the Israelites a whole lot in different words, you know. And that was part of his big speech in Deuteronomy, you know, when they were going into the promised land, you know, was telling them, do not forget, you know, once you get in there to the land of the milk and honey, do not forget, you know, what God has done for you. All right. I'm looking through now at my highlights. Does anyone else have anything highlighted they'd like to bring up? Okay.
He's a good psychologist. My favorite chapter is the third one about anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
He said something here again that I highlighted. Are you getting bored with me reading it to you? It's not like you haven't already read it. Okay.
No, please go ahead.
This sums up what's going on to some extent, to a large extent, not just in our country, but in some of the European countries and other parts of the world. He's talking about anxiety and fear. The reason there is such craziness, such a binge of fear and hate, such a propensity to brutality and violence and terror and counter-terror, the reason is that people are anxious down to the very bottom of their lives. Anxious people, when their anxiety is strong and deep enough, do crazy, destructive things to each other and to themselves, which in any other context would be shameful and unacceptable. And I thought, well, I do believe that sums it up about our world today. I think that's what's motivating a lot of people to embrace the ideas that they have and do some of the things that they're doing. I thought it was some psychology or sociology.
Yeah. Yeah. You'll find that the biblical writers had a good handle on the human psyche as well.
True.
Uh, okay. Yeah, he writes, similar to that, he says, our Western economy is rooted in a claim of scarcity, and so we scramble. The poor scramble with robbery and violence and threat. The powerful scramble with investments and tax advantages and credit and exploitation. And together, the rich and the poor create a jungle of anxiety, brutality, and violence. This is what forgetting will surely produce. And what is true in our culture is also true more closely in the family that operates on zero-sum love.
I think that comes back to what we're talking about earlier, that I lost my train of thought. I think it comes back to people thinking that somebody else is, somebody else is going to get their portion. There's not enough to go around. We can't all have jobs. We can't all have prosperity. We can't all have white privilege and male power. Something's got to give here. That's, and when it starts to slip away, people get very anxious and they get very desperate. And that's not I didn't dream that up. That's Walter Brueggemann.
Yeah. He says, it is odd to talk about self-discipline in a therapeutic, self-indulgent culture of limitless consumerism that is on an endless binge of self-satisfaction. Of course, that goes back to the, the Bible, is that we will never, if we think, along the lines of this, abundant scarcity, if we're governed by that, then there's never going to be enough, because the more you have, the more anxious you are about keeping it.
Yeah, there's that old saying, I'm glad I'm not rich because I don't have to worry about losing all my money.
Says the enduring act of love is generosity. The world teaches us to be selfish and stingy and to look out for ourselves, but gospel love is grounded in the conviction that all we have is a gift from God, who has been generous with us, and we are invited to practice generosity alongside the God of the gospel. So how would you explain how generosity is part of love? Are we generous in love in ways other than sharing material things?
Well, it's also sharing your time with people.
You share time with people you love.
And talents, if you can do something someone else can't and you do that for them.
And sometimes I talk with premarital conversations with folks. The idea of, when you stop counting the costs, and stop keeping score, and can become generous without thinking about it, then that's what a lasting love relationship is.
Uh-oh, who went away?
Peggy.
Oh,
Okay. All right, we're getting on 2 o'clock and Peggy's gonna have to go.
Yeah, she's gone.
She
Oh,
just,
okay, she is gone. Okay. Um, he cites as another example of anxiety. And well, and I guess you could also say this is uh, anxiety over scarcity, road rage.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea that our time is more valuable than someone else's time, or that, a parking space, we deserve a parking space more than someone else, or any of those, situations, that we read about, road rage, and people have been killed over them. And there's still an element there of anxiety and a feeling of scarcity that comes from that phenomenon. Um, He says, our life does not finally depend upon our being in control or our being right. Another thing, the primal business of our life is to yield and trust to the God who loves us more than we love ourselves. That's kind of hard to comprehend, isn't it?
It's a powerful statement.
Yeah. And you think so much of depression and anger comes from the feeling of being unloved. So another example of how being generous, with our love creates, instills love in others. Sadly, too many children, have grown up, feeling that scarcity of love, whether, it's real or just perceived. You look at all these young men, basically just teenagers who go on these shooting rampages. There's obviously something missing that they're trying to gain back through this misguided idea that if I can keep somebody, I haven't had the life I should have, so then I'm going to make sure that other people don't have a life. Kind of. No, I mean, that's sort of the only way that you can make any sense of the kind of mindset that wants to go in and just, and particularly the way school children have been so targeted by these young men. It's almost like, I had a lousy childhood, so, you're not going to have one, in a sense. He writes, and when we cease to trust promises and no longer hope, we end in despair, for despair is the counter to hope, and despairing people act greedily because we believe God has no new gifts to give. Let's see, right in this. Gosh. Go through, make sure I put things from each chapter. what does he say? In chapter 2, he talks a lot about dominant culture. What does he mean by that, do you think?
In other words, those are the things that we consider as a, our culture would consider very important, and that we pay attention to, I believe. I'm not sure that they would say that dominant culture is necessarily, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in this regard, but I think that it may be just in the United States, we are, as you mentioned about vacation, that, and you play even, people, it's not just, well, we're going up to Wisconsin, for a weekend or, to get away. It's like, well, we're going to go to Europe and take the kids and all. I mean, it's just become so much more than necessarily, and there's a status to some of these things. So, and the idea of the instant availability by cell phone, that's it. One thing, if I may say, about the tour, which was refreshing, we had to have our cell phones on silent, and we couldn't use them on the bus. And that was very good. We couldn't talk. Well, I mean, with 40 people, if you had conversations going on. So that was refreshing. And then at times we couldn't get cell service, which was good, So
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that kind of fit into the idea of dominant culture?
And he's describing basically our own culture. But one thing that struck me was he says that a dominant culture imposes a high degree of conformity on all the members of the community. And what kind of pressure does that put on people? If a dominant culture demands conformity, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, if you're not exactly like everybody else, you can pay for it at work or at home or at school or
Yeah, I see, some of the latest actions or promises of the future in the Supreme Court of demanding more conformity to a dominant culture. Moving and taking away voting rights, taking away the right of gay marriage, taking these kinds of things. Are really going back into this demand for conformity. We have he mentions an example that always strikes me as survival shows. I'm, when Tom likes to channel surf, drives me nuts. But anyway, one thing I notice is how many shows are based solely on competition. It started out with Survivor, and then, it's like, then we got into everything like dancing. You can't just watch dance, you have to compete, Dancing with the Stars. Everything, it seems on TV of these reality type shows are all about competition and creating winners and losers. And sometimes it has to do with, entertainment being humiliating the losers. And that becomes part of the entertainment of the show.
You're fired. You're fired. And we know who was that person too.
Yeah. But there's so much of it on
dating, the idea of the dating, and that, you talk about humiliation. I mean, that's terrible.
Yeah.
And no matter how good you are, you see these dancers and you look at it and go, my gosh, that person looks like a professional. I can't tell the teacher from the student. And when they get through, they start telling them everything that was wrong, that their spirit wasn't in it, and or like the baking competitions where, it doesn't instill a mood, or I mean, it gets ridiculous. It's no matter how good they are, it's not quite good enough.
Hmm. I hadn't thought about that. That's
Oh,
really a good point.
that bugs me to no end.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought
I
about, you know,
It's not good enough. Ever.
I mentioned earlier on about and one of the list of words that he uses a lot and throughout his book. One is alternative, and what we're just talking about is, with the Supreme Court, alternative lifestyles and this sort of thing. And he says, we do not need poetry or artistry or imagination if we only want to wallow in our status quo. The poet stakes a claim against such present reality. This act of imagination subverts our status quo and invites us to an alternative. He says, when the truth is told, a new world remains possible. So despite all the criticism, that he lays on contemporary culture, he always, going back to God, going back to the scriptures, he, always puts hope alongside, the despair. And for Brueggemann, hope has to win, if we are going to all thrive. And when we take away others' hope, how destructive that is to our whole society. Okay, I'm going to draw this to a close. We could go on for a long time probably about this. So I want to go on ahead, and feel free if you think of things for the next week, that are in chapter 3 or that is absolutely fine. I spent a good deal of time with introduction at the beginning. So we probably spent a little bit more time in these first 3 chapters. But for the next time, you'll read, it's divided into parts, and each one is 3 chapters. So if you'll go ahead with the next 3.
Oh, I thought we were reading 4 at a time. I read ahead.
Well, okay, you're ahead of the game. You just go back and look at your highlights.
I didn't mean to do that.
Okay, let me go back to the beginning and make sure I've got my titles of gospel. Here we go, comments. Okay, so we have, next we will have chapters 4, 5, and 6, God's fidelity and ours, Jesus, and justice.
Good.
Okay. We'll go in peace and enjoy this beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much so.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.